All right, with a large number of names thrown at you thus far, especially British politicians, here's going to be another one. Now, we're going to be talking about the Townsend tea tax. Now, this might well be one of the most famous taxes that was ever involved in colonial America. And we have also what's known as the Boston Massacre, a basically a PR disaster for the British that was readily used by the Patriots. Okay. Now, our newest, or I should say, our latest British politician is an individual known as Charles Champagne Charlie Townsend, Member of Parliament, a man who could deliver brilliant speeches before Parliament, even while totally drunk. Now, this means one of two things in my mind. Either this was one of the greatest speakers of all time, or the bar was not that high for a great speech, but he was persuasive. Champagne Charlie was able to convince Parliament to pass what came to be known as the Townsend Acts in 1767. Now, if the American colonists had been upset beforehand, this was going to throw gasoline on that fuse that was rapidly heading toward revolution. Now, the Townsend Acts, what they essentially did was one, they put light taxes on things like lead, paper, paint, and tea. Now, the other thing is they weren't permanent. They were all later repealed, except for one, and that was tea. Now, most of the colonists drank tea on a fairly regular basis. Now, while there was an abundant amount of water in the area, you've got to remember this is a point in time where germs, bacteria, amoeba, stuff like that wasn't totally understood. As a result, it was a lot safer to drink things like tea because the water had been boiled. It became safer. So, this was the beverage of choice. You can think about the way we have a Starbucks on practically every corner in the world, it seems. This was the way the colonists looked at their tea. Now, during this time frame, 1767, the legislature, the colonial legislature of New York, was suspended by the crown for failure to comply with the Quartering Act. Remember, we talked about the Quartering Act. This was the rule, the law, the act that said if the crown were to send troops to a colony, it was the responsibility of the colony to make sure that they were both fed and housed. Well, New York failed to comply with the Quartering Act, and as such, their legislature was suspended. Now, this did not sit well with the colonists. The colonists had a love for representative government. They had a representative legislature essentially in every one of the colonies. And when the people of New York lost their legislature, this again helped accelerate that burning fuse. Now, even though they kept that tax on tea, tea now became a smuggled commodity. To enforce the law, the British now had to send troops to America. So they put this law in place. They put this tax on tea. They ban or they suspend New York's legislature. People now are going to start smuggling tea to get around the law. In order to try and halt that, the British are going to have to send troops to the colonies in order to keep the law upheld. And this is going to lead to a major problem in Boston. Okay? Now, in the city of Boston, you have to take into account that when the troops were not on duty, they were in competition with the citizens of Boston for various jobs. So there was some ill will between the people of Boston and the redcoats that were there. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, you had a crowd of about 60 townspeople in Boston started harassing about 10 redcoats, about 10 troops. Um, Basically, they're not happy with what they refer to as these lobsterbacks. They would go through, and one fellow, for example, got hit on the head. Another got hit by a club. They were throwing snowballs at them. They were basically making a nuisance of themselves. Then it started to get a little bit worse. Those snowballs became chunks of ice packed in snow. At one point, without any orders whatsoever, someone fired a shot. Now, the picture you can see there on the left, that was an engraving made by Paul Revere. Basically, giving his version of how things happened. Now, there were no orders. The troops had been provoked, and at some point, whether or not it was one soldier had had enough or whether or not it was a complete accident, a shot was fired. The other troops, with that first shot, they also fired as well. When all was said and done, there were 11 innocent civilians who had been wounded or killed, including one gentleman by the name of Crispus Attucks. Now, Crispus Attucks was a former slave, and he was the quote unquote leader of the mob in the Boston Massacre. He became a symbol. Okay, this was a guy who had gone from slave to freeman to martyr, someone who had been willing to stand up for liberty against Great Britain. Now, these troops did get in trouble for that. In fact, two were put on trial and were possibly in jeopardy of their life. But they were defended by a Massachusetts lawyer named John Adams, who was able to help keep them from going to jail or being executed. John Adams would later become one of the founding fathers and would be the second president of the United States.